Hello. Welcome in to a Gorilla Sports Off Ice Monday edition show presented by Trusted American. Trusted American salary-based mortgage consultants want to help you get into a better interest rate and lower your monthly payments. Go to trustedamerican.com to see how much they can save you today.
Hello and welcome in.
Please do not leave your luggage unattended on the station.
Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in for Gorilla Sports Off Ice. I'm Meghan Angley, joined in the studio by Chloe Theil today for an all-girls show. Woo! And we are here to talk about Mikko Rantanen. All right, Chloe, let's wind it back here for a second. Where were you when you heard the news? Walk me through your initial reaction.
So I was sick all of last week, and this was Friday night. So I was laying in bed, and I think it kind of snapped me out of my sickness in a way. Like, I heard the news, and I was like, oh my God.
more
It was
time to
the
be
first time
sick.
I had stood up in like 3 days. I was like,
Oh, no.
you guys can't believe that this just happened. It was a shock. I mean, I think that was everything I was reading, everybody that was talking about it. It was just kind of like nobody knew what was going on and why this was happening and why it was happening now at 7 p.m. on a Friday night. So, yeah.
All right, and to recap, in case you missed it somehow,
Yeah.
Mikko Rantanen was traded to the Carolina Hurricanes on Friday, late Friday night, in a 3-team trade. Carolina received Mikko Rantanen, Taylor Hall, and rights to a former Chicago Blackhawks prospect. Colorado received Martin Necas and Jack Drury and 2 picks, and Chicago got a 2025 their own third-round pick back in the trade and retained some of Mikko Rantanen's salary on behalf of Carolina now. And so it took a little bit for the details of the trade to come through.
Mm-hmm.
That was already a little bit dicey, but let's talk a little bit about what Mikko Rantanen was to the Avs. This player was drafted in the first round in 2015 and has spent the entirety of his 10-year NHL career, 9.5 seasons here with the Avs through this point. This year, he was having an incredible pace with 25 goals, 39 assists in 49 games. And he recorded 681 points in his time with the franchise, ranking him 7th on the franchise's all-time list in points and assists and 6 in goals. In the playoffs, he was a performer that, to our frustration, sometimes would go quiet for a few games, but he always made an impact. He had 101 points in playoff games, back-to-back goals in all 4 games in the Western Conference Final in their sweep over Edmonton. So a huge playoff performer for the Avs, in addition to being just a top 10 player in the league. He always made an impact from the 50-goal season to back-to-back 100-point seasons. This is somebody that is very shocking to see leave the Avs.
Mm-hmm. This was a huge conversation when I was working with them last year. It was never a conversation of why wouldn't they sign him? You know what I mean? There was no reason that you wouldn't re-sign a player like this, especially when he's been with the Avs for this long, and also being maybe one of the top 10, 15 players in the league. You don't see that very often, that they're getting traded mid-year, weeks before the deadline. So yeah, it was a crazy move to make.
We'll get into this a little bit more, but I also was adamant anytime that I was asked that I didn't believe Mikko Rantanen would be traded, because everything that I had heard through this point pointed to negotiations being tough, possibly being dragged out till the summer,
Right.
and so something that they might address, once the season had ended. But all signs pointed to Mikko Rantanen being retained as a piece in this core. Did you consider the possibility of him being traded more seriously?
I didn't. And one of the things too is, when you're working in PR, they have to kind of prepare for everything. So I actually wrote out his contract extension last year. And that to me kind of sealed the deal that yes, it was happening, but also you can't assume that those things are happening. You know what I mean?
Right.
Just because we're writing the deal doesn't mean that it's actually going to go through. So I never thought that he would be traded. Ever since he started, I thought there's no way that he leaves and goes to any other team except for the Avs.
That's an amazing point about the press release getting prepped ahead of the season for an extension. I think points to where negotiations did break down to an untenable point at some point, obviously recently. I also wanted to know, since you were around the team so much, what your view of Rantanen was as a person.
He's a great person. I think, a lot of the stuff that's come out of this is people saying that maybe there's an issue with him in the locker room, and I never got that vibe. I was more around players separately than I was all of them together, but I always thought that he was the nicest guy and he had a great attitude. I thought maybe one day he could be a captain. Like I think that he was able to lead the team, and I never would think that there would be any disconnect between him and the locker room, and I still don't really think that.
I don't either. I remember when the former social media person left for another job, Mikko Rantanen was one of the first to congratulate her and send her well wishes and address her on a first name basis. And I always thought it stood out to me, like an Eric Johnson, he was somebody that learned everybody's names. And so it wasn't just about being a part of the team, teammate to teammate. He considered everybody working in the organization as somebody that was worth knowing. Just the last practice before they went on the road trip, he was asking Ryan Bolding, he writes for NHL.com, what do reporters do during the Four Nations break? And he was just a curious little guy, just caring and kind and always easy to talk to. That's why he won the Media Tolerance Award when Peter Baugh was with us, and he got a plaque for always being game to do interviews, win or lose. And I respected that a lot about Mikko Rantanen.
And I know Andy put up the super chat on the screen, but if you want to put it back up, Andy, they're not going to win another cup for the rest of Cale's career. Their next window is the next time they'll compete for a cup. CMAC for prison.
CMAC for prison. Hurricane Teabag, thank you so much for the super chat. I know the vibes are a little bit down right now, and there's a lot of concern around what the front office is doing. This is obviously really drastic. We were celebrating when they upended the goaltending tandem in a matter of days. That was a drastic measure that was necessary this season. This wasn't a problem that needed to be treated from our view. Like Mikko Rantanen, his impact to this team, I talked about the points pace production he was on this year. This wasn't a problem. He's a valued teammate. You see that in the reaction from players like McKinnon and Makar following the news of the trade. And so this one feels a little bit different to measure because the goaltending was obvious.
And even though the goaltending was obvious and needed a change, people were still confused and upset about what CMAC was doing when he made the trade with Eustace. And it's always going to be like that. I think anytime a GM makes a move like this, people are going to question why he did it and what the outcome is going to be. And I've said it before, I have to say it again. You have to trust your GM at the end of the day. Maybe people didn't really trust him with goaltending, and now look where we're at. I mean, there's stuff that they know that we don't, and there's moves that they could still potentially be making. So I don't want to. I think, like, yes, if this doesn't work out the way that CMAC wants it to work out, then maybe his job is potentially in danger. But that's so far in advance. We're still right at the beginning of this, and I don't want to make any decisions on CMAC depending on this.
Conclusions. But you're right. This is the type of move that can make or break a GM's career. And typically the best player in the trade, isn't going to the losing team in the trade. And it's easy to look at Mikko Rantanen and say that. I think that's a pretty objective take. I'm so excited about Necas on this team. And so I do like the return. It's hard to fill the void left by Mikko Rantanen, but we'll unpack that in a second. I want to get to kind of what you talked about when I sat down in the chair. There have been so many conflicting reports about this trade, how it went down, and how the negotiations broke down at the end of the day. So I kind of want to bring them all to the forefront so we can unpack them. So the first thing that came out from the Athletic, Pierre LeBrun reported that Rantanen was willing to take less than what a July 1 market number looked like to stay in Colorado. But even then, that number was not even in the same realm that the Avs were in. And so we had heard 14 million attached to Rantanen for the longest time because of that Draisaitl contract kind of setting the tone with the cap going up next year. That was the number people attached to Rantanen, also represented by the same agent. But this was sort of walking that back a little bit, that Rantanen wasn't married to 14 mil and was willing to take less than that. But even then, it wasn't a number the Avs were comfortable with. So keeping in mind Nathan MacKinnon's current salary is 12.6, that is a number that gets referenced a lot. Following that report is the one from Elliot Friedman on Sportsnet, and you have the tweet pulled that talks about this report specifically.
It's the tweet that talks about Friedman's tweet.
It's believed around the league that the Avs were willing to make Rantanen the highest paid winger, offering around $11.75, which would make him the highest winger in the league, above Panarin, but not willing to place him above MacKinnon, which affirms this internal cap belief that's sort of been discussed, that there was this internal Avs cap set at MacKinnon's salary. And so Rantanen came out to Finnish media and speculated that Rantanen's salary demands were just too high. And this is where I feel for Rantanen, because I don't think it's as black and white as you've got a money-hungry athlete or a brain-dead front office. I think there's so much more nuance to this. Rantanen vehemently denied that the salary demands were too high, stating that he was willing to take a significant pay cut below market value, which is what both Friedman and LeBrun are reporting. He didn't think he'd be traded, which is another interesting point in this Finnish article. He believed that they'd reach a deal at some point, and the lines of the communication were open as recently as last week. And he says, for the first time, I've now experienced just how ruthless the NHL business can be. It makes me sad to see that.
That hurts my heart.
It makes me so sad to see that. But I actually think that nobody's lying. I think this is really important in how you interpret this. The biggest question is, what did Rantanen think his market value was?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote down too.
And so that 14 mil is the number we've been hearing this whole time. If that's sort of the starting point, or even just ballpark around there, even a 12.6, which is MacKinnon's salary, is a significant pay cut from $14 million, but that's still a little too rich for the Avs blood, who seem to be closer to that 11.75. And to put this into perspective, players like Matthews make 13.25, McDavid 12.5. Obviously, the Draisaitl contract at the top of this set the tone, and it's important to acknowledge the cap going up by about 5% next year paved the way for this Draisaitl contract, the timing of it, because when you look at the percentage of the cap right now that these player contracts make up, it's a different number from what Draisaitl's contract in next year's cap ceiling is going to take up. And I wanted to do some math, thankfully not live on air, but I want to put this into perspective for people a little bit, how the Avs' current roster is constructed with the 88 million cap ceiling. MacKinnon's current contract, that 12.6, makes up about 14.3% of their cap right now. And the whole of the forward group is 57%. Keeping in mind, I'm not counting Landeskog's contract, but I am counting Val Nichushkin, a player who's injured right now. So you could take out Wagner's contract from there, which is $775. We're still looking, though, at about 57% of the Avs cap is taken up by the forward group, with a player like MacKinnon taking up 14.3% of that. Rantanen's around 10.5 right now, if he were still on the team. Makar is about 10% of the cap picture, and 35% is taken up by the defensemen. The goaltending is where this conversation gets a little bit interesting. If the goaltending had been Georgiev and Annunen, like they were planning for this year, it would have been less than 5% of their salary is tied up in goaltending. If it was even like a Francouz and Georgiev, let's pretend they were willing to spend a little bit more. If Francouz had stayed healthy, that would still be around 6%. So with the new goalie tandem of Wedgwood and Blackwood, they're committing to around 7% in goaltending now. And that is with the new cap going up next year. So they are already committing a little bit more to goaltending. When you look at what's left over between the defensemen and the forward group, the 57% of cap being taken up by forwards, 35% taken up by defensemen, there's not a lot of cap space left to play around with to be investing more into goaltending, or the inevitable NHL deals for two-way players. Some of these guys are spending time in the American League, sometimes up with the NHL. And so even with the 5% increase next year, there's a Makar contract on the horizon, about a season and a half. They can begin talking about that. Seeing that Makar's current contract only takes up about 10% of their cap picture, and even with the cap going up 5%, he is due for a big payday.
Yes.
He's the best defenseman in the league. And so I can't tell you what that looks like specifically. So I'm probably undervaluing how much they probably need to plan is going to be eaten up by Makar's next contract. But between the 2% bump in goaltending and, I don't know, 2.5% bump for Makar, that's probably not generous enough. They only had about 3% to play around with how their roster's currently constructed. They just don't have a lot of money to spend to give Rantanen more percentage of that cap. And so if you look at like the equivalent with the cap going up next year, if he wanted McKinnon money, that would be a $13 million contract, like 13.2. I don't know if that's where Rantanen was at, and that's where between 11.75 and 13.2, that's still less than the 14 mil, probably less than market value, but it's still more than the 11.75 that they were comfortable with. And I think that's where they had their hand was forced. They just can't make this picture come together. They can't make it complete. You look at like a Draisaitl contract, that's almost 16% of Edmonton's cap in one player. And McDavid, it's interesting, like when his next contract is due, they're going to have to reevaluate. But every team has to decide what they're comfortable committing to the top of the lineup. And between a Nichushkin contract and a Landeskog contract that still doesn't have enough clarity around it, a Duran who is due for an extension right now, they still need to round out their top six. And there is an issue of depth. They've gotten lucky with affordable contracts like in the Cup year, being able to construct a solid line of players in a Cogliano, a Helm, and an OC. They were able to make that picture fit because those players hit. Right now, I think that players like Kelly and Kiviranta, they're getting the most. They're getting the max value out of those players, but they don't have enough of their depth that is hit to have a complete forward group. And I think their hand was forced in seeing that this number probably will just never come together between both parties. And this is where it is cold. I think Rantanen is righteous in saying that this is a harsh business because it's cold, it's calculated. But the reality is, even if they had just kept Rantanen through the end of this contract and let him walk in free agency, there is always the risk of him getting hurt sooner than that. They recoup no assets in doing that then, or waiting till closer to the deadline. And similarly, they don't know what is going to be available and risk this not getting a good return in waiting. And so I think they wanted to ensure that they had assets that go beyond this year. Between both Necas and Drury, their contracts at least go through next year, and they save $1 million on the cap right now because both those players combined make $1 million less than Rantanen did right now. And so they've opened up a little cap space in the immediate. They've given themselves some flexibility at least into next year. And they've got 2 roster players coming back. It feels really harsh. I think that is fair to say, but it's important in the bigger picture roster, especially with the investment in goaltending, that I think force them to evaluate this differently.
The more I think about this, the more I understand why they had to do it. And one of the other reports that I saw that I want to touch on too was that he was very open to negotiating and the Avs were not at all.
Yes.
Like that there were no talks at all, which I don't understand in what world the front office wouldn't have tried to have talks with him to negotiate this contract. You know, why wouldn't they want to keep him? It doesn't make any sense, but at the same time, I personally don't think that Mikko Rantanen is worth $14 million. And the Avs got to a point where they realized that they don't think he's worth that either. I don't think he will, even if he, his contract didn't end this year and he had a few more years, they would never sign him to a contract where he made more money than Nathan MacKinnon. He is the structure of it, like you said. They base everything around that. He's the face of the organization at this point. If they were to give Rantanen more money than McKinnon, I don't know how that would affect the locker room, but you know, we don't know what he thinks his market value is. It could be that it was actually 15 million and he was willing to accept 13.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or it could have been he thinks he's worth 12 and they were only giving him 11. We have no clue what that number actually was. It was speculated that it was 14, but at the end of the day, they made a decision because they didn't really have much else to do.
Yeah.
If they've been working on this contract for the last few months and they haven't come even close to a decision on what his contract would look like, then they had to do something. If they just let him walk, then people would be more pissed than they are right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hurricane Teabag, another super chat. I hope this is cathartic for you too. He says, I understand it's hard to make it work with Moose. No one has explained to me how they'll build a contender without him. They weren't good enough with him and got worse. Where's the other big ad? I want to put a pin in that because I do think after we button up the he said, she said of it all, we do need to start talking about, all right, what next? What does this mean for the Avs moving forward? So great point from Hurricane Teabag because you're right. You just lost a top 10 in the league player and you replace him with a great player in Necas and a good player in Drury who can add to their depth. But it is not one for one the same, even with two decent players coming back. And so I do think it is important to address that. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about with the surprise from McKinnon, Makar, and definitely Rantanen is I wanted to validate the surprise. I've seen some people kind of critical or accusing them of being untruthful. Like, how are you surprised by this?
Right.
I think it is fair, though, on January 24, when the trade happens to be surprised by the hit of it at that point in time. I think any player, especially a top 10 in the league player, going into a contract year probably understands there's some possibility of a trade, but it's probably not front of mind every day when he wakes up that this is going to happen. So I don't think that takes away the shock factor. It's not to say that Rantanen didn't think this was at all a possibility as well as his teammates, but I think based on having discussions as recently as last week, it is fair for him to be surprised because he thought that the negotiations were still ongoing and that the front office hadn't reached a definitive conclusion that it was just not going to work. And that's what makes it stink is we don't know that number for Rantanen that he thought was market value and then the significant cut, right? Like my speculation is around 13. But if it was something more like a 12 and they were at 11.75 and couldn't get it closer to 12, that would be worth the pitchforks, okay, and showing up at Ball Arena wanting to talk to Chris McFarland. But I just think that it was measured more by the cap impact at the time of the signing, and because of the cap is going up, that makes it maybe a number that's higher than McKinnon, but a similar cap impact, and Avs just deemed it too rich for their blood. I'm not surprised that Chris McFarland didn't consult Cale Makar and Nathan McKinnon. I asked him about consulting players ahead of the goaltending trade, and he explained that he does not like to put his players in that position when it involves a teammate leaving. Situationally, he'll get their input about incoming players, especially if they've played with somebody already, like Tomas Tatar. He talked to Miles Wood about this player. And players are encouraged to go to Chris McFarland and ask about players like, hey, we think this guy would be a really good fit, like McKinnon referring Cogliano, for example. But there is a difference between these things, and I do think that makes a lot of sense that it wouldn't have been fair for McFarland to go to McKinnon and Makar and basically be like, I have to do this, what's your input? And they say we are not happy with it, or put them in the position of saying, yeah, you need to move on from Mikko Rantanen. They should never be in a position where they could even say that about their teammate. And so I kind of understand why it stinks, because they're obviously huge leaders and voices that are directly impacted by this, but I understand why he didn't consult them.
And it kind of has to be a surprise. I mean, if you go and tell your players that just causes so much more drama than there needs to be. Like, if you're a GM, that's your job. You have to do it because you have to do it. you're not doing it and you're not basing your decisions off of what everybody on the team thinks. This has to do with McFarland, with Sakic, with Bednar, and I don't think they're looking to consult the team in making this kind of decision. That's just not how it works. That's the business side of this. That's why it sucks, and that's why it's surprising and you lose these players.
Tulski, the GM, Kyle M, says that he made a point of saying Colorado specifically wanted to keep this trade under wraps. And I think, it was teased that a bigger trade was possibly going to happen on Friday.
Yeah.
And I think what happened is, with Rantanen's name kind of being in whispers and murmurs as a possibility of a player being moved, everybody wanted to act as fast as possible. And I think Colorado included, because if the whispers are starting to ramp up and become a little bit louder, they don't have a lot of time before that bleeds into the public and can decrease the value that's coming back to Colorado. So I think that, to your point, there's an important part of strategy with trades involved there too, that I think unfairly has maybe painted Chris McFarland as a total villain. But this is kind of the important part now. What does this do to the Avs locker room? It's a huge player, a part of their leadership group who wore a letter.
Yeah, and there's really no way to tell how this is gonna affect them. And they'll always do their best. I mean, they're never gonna stop playing as hard or deviate from the way they play because of something like this. So I don't think that it's gonna change a lot. I do think that they're missing a personality factor that was big in the locker room. But as for playing on the ice, I think, there's really nothing you can do, and I don't think it'll affect each player individually playing. I think as a whole, they're going to have to learn how to play without him. But other than that, most of them are there to win, and this trade isn't going to stop them from doing that.
I think that's a great point. They are seasoned pros. I don't doubt that losing a friend is probably a tough part. Like, the on-ice product is probably more affected by how do these new pieces fit and can they continue to find success there. But I have to imagine losing a friend that you got to see every day abruptly is its own challenge that's going to require some healing, and I can see that having a little bit of an impact. Do you worry that, what kind of message do you think this sends to the rest of the team, good, bad, or otherwise?
I don't know. I think, the message I would take from it if I were a player is that you think you're irreplaceable, you're not. You know what I mean? You think that Mikko would be on the Avs for the rest of his career, and now he's not. They're going to find a way to replace him in this situation. And he wanted more money, and they didn't think that he was worth that. So instead of, kind of giving him what he wanted and putting at risk, having a bigger Kale contract come through and all of that stuff, they decided that they were going to move on from him. So I'm sure the team looks at this and thinks, now I have to really step this up. If a top 10, 15 player in the league can be sent and traded to a different team, then so can I.
I think that's an interesting point. Bama Metcalf writes, it's a wake-up call to the team and kind of has been needed. All the leadership wasn't showing up in these games. And I do think that kind of cutthroat, nobody's irreplaceable, is interesting. Because on one hand, that can wake people up and light a fire under them. But what if that backfires? What if it leads to... I think it's a careful line you have to toe. I see this with coaches whose approach to coaching is also a little bit cutthroat, like the kinds of players who will bench a top 6 guy, staple him to the bench for an entire period kind of thing. And I know that doesn't always inspire the best out of players. I think the alternative message I think that it sends is a commitment to the window of opportunity for competing for a cup. Because in the immediate, I think it's fair to wonder if this team can go for another cup this year. But looking forward, future planning, I do think this sets them up to to add more than they were able to. And it's hard because Mikko Rantanen won them a cup. So I kind of feel a confidence that that is the kind of player in your core who can bring you to a cup because I saw him do it. Do you think they can win another cup without a Rantanen?
I think they can. And I mean, looking at the team at a whole, and this is something I want to bring up too. If they don't do something else with this trade, I'll be a little confused.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to ask you that before we answer if we think they can win a cup, because do you think that there's something else that they're planning to do with the trade?
I definitely do. In part because of the at least $1 million immediately in cap relief that they get in moving on from Rantanen's contract right now. I think that it opens up the possibility for more. And then the Landeskog of it all. They need to get some clarity on what that means. If they're gearing up for the return of a Landeskog, then they absolutely needed to brace themselves to absorb that contract come that time. And that would maybe mean needing $1 million extra in relief wherever they can get it. But I think the depth is obviously concerned, and it hasn't been fully addressed. Like, they add Drury, who's a great bottom six guy, but Necas is now just replacing Rantanen in the top six. They
Right.
still need more depth. So that's where I could also see them adding. And I know that adding a fourth line player maybe doesn't take the sting off of losing a Rantanen, but I do look back to the depth of the cup team, and that's where they were lacking the most. And we haven't seen a complete top six this year, which makes it hard to talk about because I think that's, when healthy, the most complete part of the team. McKinnon is still so good that he has these almost individual effort nights where he completely changes the course of a game single-handedly. And same with Makar, who's having a productive year, but I think quietly his defensive game has improved too. I know there was maybe some, like, over these last just couple games, maybe there's been a couple little gaps, but he obviously just had this incredibly impressive effort against New York. And he's the kind of player who any mistakes he's going to make up for in double the effort, and he impacts the game in such an important way that I think the top of the lineup is still pretty complete, even without a Rantanen, because I think every team has to make sacrifices and they have to confront luxuries they can no longer afford. And so because this is where the Nichushkin part's interesting too. Like, he's injured right now, but don't forget him in all of this. It's a luxury to have let's say top 15, top 20 players in the league, to have 3 of them, right? You've got Makar, you've got McKinnon, you've got Rantanen, but then there's a Nichushkin who I think can compete and be among the top 15, 20 players in the league as well. Drury, again, we haven't seen a fully healthy, but I think to have, all right, we're now looking at maybe 5. If a Landeskog is even healthy and playing, I'm not going to count him in that, but the Avs are able to hold on to almost 6 players who are in and around that conversation. That is a luxury that most teams can't afford. And I think the day of reckoning came for the Avs, that they also can't afford this much luxury at the top of their lineup.
Yeah, and I love the way you put that that's a luxury that they can't afford. I think with the top, not the top 6, but with a Cale Makar, with a Nathan McKinnon, with a Nichushkin, with a Drury even, I think with them, it's entirely possible for them to win a Stanley Cup. I wouldn't discount it. I think there's a lot that needs to be adjusted around those players, for sure. But I don't think that losing Mikko is going to prevent them from winning a cup.
I agree. We talk about Edmonton on this podcast and how there are obvious holes in their lineup, but they did make it to a Stanley Cup final. So even with those holes, you look at kind of how they're constructed. I'm not using them as the blueprint. I don't think the Avs should model what they do off of them, but they have the Draisaitl and McDavid at the top.
Yep.
Goaltending is something that they've also kind of tried to save money on that area of their lineup. And then defense at the top, like, they've paid way too much to Darnell Nurse, but they've got kind of a reliable Ekholm and then an Evan Bouchard who's a young but fallible player. And then they kind of yeeted the rest of the defensive core, and that's obviously the biggest hole. I look at where the Avs are at, because I think Edmonton has decent forward depth for what it's worth, and they've loaded up on it this year, but they're also going to have to make tough decisions around an Evander Kane. in the future. And so again, every team is faced with these types of decision, and a lot of them too have time limits. Like a Jeff Skinner isn't going to just continue to be a possibility for them, and being able to pay what they pay to a Corey Perry type player, it's like a one-trick pony. And so the Avs one-trick pony, the time was up. And that's where every team is going to have to be faced with that too. Like, even if they have the depth right now, it's not going to last much longer beyond a season. And that's where I think the Avs will try to replenish the hardest. But to your point, I agree. I think they can still win a cup with this roster. I think that they're just being faced with a wake-up call that other teams around the league who compete in Stanley Cup finals and make the playoffs year after year also have to address these things. It's just time to pay the piper for the Colorado Avalanche.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's great to use them as in comparison to the Avs, because I think it would be very similar if the Avs decided to sign that agreement with Rantanen, almost like they did with Draisaitl. And but it's, if you really look at their team, you know, they get close but not close enough. And you kind of have to decide, if you're the Avs, if that's, you know, something they want to be able to get close, but then to not have the depth to actually win, or to address their problems now and move Rantanen around and try to fix the other problems to get them there.
Yeah, I think another move is probably coming, because you don't ship out a core player, add 2 roster players, that's all well and good, and stop there.
Right.
Though it's a drastic move that needs to have then a drastic return. The return was good, but it wasn't drastic. And so I'm not anticipating another bold move to yield that kind of return. I just think when we measure this trade, it's almost going to be an A and B thing. Like, this is A, and then there's maybe something else that they're targeting around the deadline that accompanies it that was only made possible because they moved on from Rantanen.
And we have to address, if you think that a big move that they can make is Crosby.
Sidney Crosby.
You have to talk about it?
I don't know. I've never believed it. I thought that there was some possibility before Crosby did ink his extension this last year. Like, that window was then open, then maybe that door had opened. But when he did, I kind of felt like that door closed. And I do feel, though, that the thing that's missing is the old guy you want to win the cup for, like a Parisi or a formerly a Cogliano.
Yeah.
Like, they're missing that type of thing that galvanizes them, but also has veteran experience and is willing to impart that on the team. I do think there's something to be said. Like, there's good leaders in that locker room, but I do think that there's a respect that also comes from kind of the older player, especially one like a Crosby, who is also one of the best players to have ever played and is still very good and has won before. I think a guy who's won before, like a Crosby, makes so much sense. I just don't know how realistic it is with everything we're told. Like, I follow some Pittsburgh media to get a pulse check for what they're saying on their side, and I'm still seeing it shut down on their end of things. But I love the national media and the Colorado people who like to keep this hope alive, because he'd be a fantastic, obvious fit here. What do you think?
I think sort of the same thing. I never really believed that this would actually happen. It would be really cool if it did. But I think if it were to happen, I think he would kind of fill that captain spot a little bit, give the locker room some direction without Gabe in there. But I don't know. I think it's very unlikely that they actually go through with doing that. I think it was definitely brought up in media, and people kind of made it a big thing when
fun.
It was really, like, there's nothing really, like, there's no evidence to make anyone believe that this could potentially be happening. So yes, it is fun, and it makes it more fun after losing Mikko to consider, hey, maybe we'd get Crosby in return. But yeah, I'm not sure.
I feel like when there's smoke, there's fire, but you also can't start the fire yourself and be like, hey guys, do you see that smoke over there? And so that's how I feel about the Crosby rumors, is like somebody's making fires. They're like, whoa, do you guys see this right now?
Yeah.
Crosby's
It's Biz.
coming.
Biz is the one making the fire.
Is making the fires.
Yeah.
And so it's fun. I don't want to sound like I'm dunking on the idea of it, but to your point, I don't know that it's been substantiated by anything other than this making a fire.
If the Avs get Crosby, then we will fill a tin with whipped cream and smash it in Jesse's face.
You heard it here
Deal?
first, guys. We will
Deal?
be smashing a pie tin in Jesse's face
if we get Crosby.
if Crosby comes.
I don't know if Jesse's listening, but you guys let him know that that's going to be happening.
And to make up for throwing a pie in Jesse's face, we will also come with a 7 Brew coffee to make up for it. In case you didn't know, 7 Brew Coffee is a one-of-a-kind drive-through and walk-up experience with a fast and friendly crew that is waiting to serve you, from which bold coffee to refreshing energy drinks, smoothies, teas, and milkshakes, which is probably what we'd get Jesse. 7 Brew has you covered with over 20,000 flavor combinations. There's a perfect drink for everyone. At 7 Brew, they believe in cultivating kindness with every cup, and their fully customizable menu is just the beginning. Before you hit the road, power up with 7 Brew and Firestone and experience the coffee revolution. All right.
That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
I love
I love
the transition was amazing.
Love Phil Kessel. I know you're not being serious. I love Phil Kessel. Jonathan Toews. I have seen that his possibility of a return to hockey isn't for another year anyways. That's why I'm not going to entertain it much. It's a name that I think has been linked to Colorado before, so look, I won't rule that out for a future, but I don't think that's a name that we should be talking about for the Avs for this season to gear them up for their cup run. As much as it sounds nice on paper, because I mean that was the Parise thing, right? Like he had not been playing hockey, and he comes back, he geared up for play and made his return to hockey with the Avs. So I kind of like the concept, but I also don't want to John Klingberg the Avs this season. So you gotta be careful pulling guys out who've been away from the game like that for some time. All right, let's talk about who the Avs get in this trade too. I want to start with Necas because we've seen now 2 games from him. Avs don't win the first game, but I think we got to see a glimpse at what he might bring to the lineup in the New York game. Really excited for this player. He's 26 years old. Mikko's 28, so a couple years difference in age. Another first-round draft pick from the 2017 draft, and he's had an interesting role in Carolina. I think that he's previously solidly held a top 6 role for a reason. He's a first round caliber player. I think he's been in the top 9 because he's found some chemistry on this line of Kotkaniemi. So sorry if I butcher that. Kotkaniemi and Eric Robertson. That was kind of a third line in role, but he was still like a trigger man on their top unit. Great playmaking, pace, and transition game, which is why I think there's going to be such a natural fit for Necas. And if Andy could show it's not a player card per se, it's his edge stats, because his skating is, I think, where we're going to see a strength of fit, and that is in his top skating speed and speed bursts. He can keep up with the pace at which the Avs like to play. His shooting percentage, 13.9% this year, is a very welcome thing on a team of highs and lows in that regard. Top 96 percentile for top shot speed, which we saw in the one-timer on the power play with the Avs just in this last game. He led the Hurricanes with 55 points before the trade, first star of the month in November after leading all skaters with 22 points, and 22 of his 55 points came on the power play, tying him for 5th among all players in power play scoring. And I think that is important to talk about because the Avs power play has also struggled, and the words predictable or stagnant have come to mind. And this is a different type of player who has found success on the power play this year, but is also just producing at a pretty great clip. And you look at all facets of his game. This NHL Edge measures a couple different things like shot speed, but also top speed, shooting percentage. And so this is a player that makes a lot of stylistic sense for the way that Colorado likes to play.
He looked great yesterday.
Yeah.
I enjoyed watching him play so much in that game, and it was hard to watch because they wanted to get him a goal so badly, and it just wasn't working. But he hit the post 2-3 times in that one power play alone, and that gives me so much faith in this player, and surprise, the power play looks a lot better. when he is in the lineup.
I loved what he added, but I also love how quickly that made sense, because it's going to take some time for him to get adjusted to the way that Colorado likes to play as well, because he's coming from a very rigid structure, which is great. I think Carolina is one of the best defensive teams as a team, and it requires then playing within their structure, very disciplined. And so I think that is something that's also going to translate well, that maybe doesn't show up on a score sheet specifically, but I think we're going to see a relatively responsible player who doesn't have bad habits in his game that needs to be coached out of him. And that's true of both Drury and Necas. But I also think too, then there's going to still be some adjustment to the structure, since it is a little bit different. And even just the power play, they're going to have to reevaluate how they want to execute each time. And I think that to see it click so instantly is such a good sign that it's going to work out.
I think the Avs are so good at picking up players that know that they have a little bit more in them. And
yes,
they're like Casey Middlestat, playing with Buffalo, and they knew he had a little bit in him, and they brought it out of him, So I think it's the same thing with both of these players. I think they have a little bit more to give. I think Necas too in Carolina, I think he had a few stretches where it was kind of like he disappeared a little bit offensively, but I'm interested to see how the organization, how it brings that out of him.
And this is a player who is signed through next season for $6.5 million a year. And with the cap going up, that just gives them a little bit more flexibility. And I think having a top 6 option locked in for next year alleviates some tension on the bigger picture for the Avs. And I love what you're talking about, this bump in play that players can experience in coming to Colorado. And the Avs are certainly counting on this with Jack Drury. If we want to show his player card, this is actually a J Fresh card, I think. This is a 24-year-old who has Ivan numbers in terms of production with 3 goals and 6 assists, but he is being touted as a possible 3C option already used on a line with Wood and Colton. And I think the early results show that this is something that might take a little bit of time to come together, but on paper, he has such Logan O'Connor vibes. He's gritty, he's competitive, he kills penalties, but he's also a solid face-off guy. He was on par for a career high at 58.8% at the face-off dot, had 27 points last year, which is very Logan O'Connor-y in terms of number. And with the Colorado bump in mind, Chris McFarland certainly hopes that there's an offensive bump to be had here in Colorado. I do think there's something to be said for, if the player is capable of it, there's a freeing way in which the way Colorado likes to play that I think can lend itself to an offensive bump. Now, both Carolina and Colorado strong possession teams spend a lot of time in the O-zone, where I think that Jack Drury will get an offensive advantage here is through minutes. I think you look at his average ice time for this season, and he already exceeded it in Game 2. And so I think that is something that inevitably can be a bigger part of his game than we've seen, in the same way that we've watched Logan O'Connor grow. So as you can see, the WAR is kind of like the game impact. And so that's not a very high number. And this is just this season. You can see that line has sort of trended a bit downward, but this is a player that is strong defensively. So going back to the way that Carolina's structure is so defensively sound, I think we're going to already like that aspect of him. He's going to be responsible. He doesn't hurt the team in any way. But I think in talking about players like Kiviranta and Kelly, who I think they're getting max value out of, I think they'd like for those players to become more solidly fourth liners. And this is a player in Drury that I think maybe can add a little more offensively than those two, that they want to try out in a third line role to start making that more of a third line again. We were spoiled with Wood, Colton, and OC. We haven't really gotten to see anything close to that. Kivy, Kelly, OC has been, again, solid, reliable, but they're not impacting the game offensively. I think if you can get a little bit more production from that third line, which hopefully a player like Drury being complemented by a Ross Colton and a Miles Wood, who will need to get up to game speed, I like then 1 through 3 how they're looking. Again, that line 2, depending on how you look at it, let's pretend Val Nichushkin's healthy, because even though he experienced a little bit of a setback, this is a player that they're expecting back in their top 6 before the end of the regular season easily. So however you structure the top 6, right? You've got a Druin, a McKinnon, a Necas, you've got a Lehkonen, a Middlestat, and who am I forgetting? Parsonen's there right now.
You're saying with Val in the lineup?
Yeah,
Or
did
you're
I already
saying
put Val up? Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the top 6. It
Yeah,
doesn't
you
have to
didn't say
be
Val.
exact. Oh, okay, put Val in there.
Mhm.
All right, so Druin, Necas, McKinnon. You're right.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. No Parsonen. Pretend I didn't say that. You've got lines 1 through 3. I know that without a Rantanen, that doesn't wow you quite as much, but they have not found the right mix in their top 6, even with Rantanen in the picture. And it's been because they haven't had everybody together all at once. It's not Rantanen's fault. But I think because we haven't even seen, it wasn't like Rantanen and McKinnon, they have to be together in order for them to find success. They were separated at multiple points this year. Lines 1 and 2 were never quite set in stone. And that's why I think it's acceptable for that to be the top 6 in some way, no matter how you mix it. And now you have a third line. Now you have lines 1 through 3, and you're not talking about Kelly Kiviranta OC as your third line anymore. It can more properly become something of a fourth line. That's already starting to sound a lot better to me.
Yeah. Somebody mentioned that in the chat too about how seeing them in the fourth line yesterday just made so much more sense. And I agree. And they have been moving their lines around a lot. I liked when it was Nate and Mikko split up. I liked when Mikko was on the second line, but I do think that they needed a little bit of that structure because without it, that's where things start to kind of fall apart, even within a power play too. If you don't know where your role is on each of those lines, then you start to deviate from the norm. So I think it's good that they finally have like a 3C and that they can look at those 3 lines and think like, we're happy with this.
And it's worth noting, obviously Middlestat's game this year hasn't been to where they want it. So maybe it still feels a little risky to have him as the 2C in how I'm talking about this. But I think even without that part of the equation, with Rantanen back in the mix, it still felt like the success of a team on a given night was whether or not the top line was going. And even with Rantanen in the mix, that didn't happen every night. Sometimes it felt like, all right, well, what kind of a night is Nathan McKinnon having? And even if he's not doing anything to hurt the team specifically, if he's not going, it just, you're not getting the support you need elsewhere in a way that you can count on. And so I don't think that points to Rantanen being expendable at all. I just think it points to possibility in terms of what the top 6 can be capable of. And I think to your point, having a little bit more depth now, you can start to see a fourth line act like a fourth line, but in the way that they can impact the game. Like even Parsonen, Middlestat, Lehkonen, they've back-to-back points in games, and they found something that's working for right now. I think Lehkonen and Middlestat, it's important for those two specifically to play together, but I think that's the type of possibility that's unlocked, and only made better with a Nichushkin in the mix.
I do hope that we get one more little glimpse at Val's pals.
I was thinking about that the other day. Like sometimes Val's pals are the friends you make along the way. And I do think we'll get another glimpse at Val's pals. He's so important to this team. I think that's maybe what's not being talked about enough around the Rantanen trade. And look, I'm not going to pretend this isn't a scary conversation because Val's reliability is called into question each year. And Rantanen's wasn't. He was a healthy player that you could count on for close to 82 games in a regular season most of the time and, lengthy playoff runs. And so it's not that one makes up for the other, but that's where Colorado invested in Val with his contract extension following the Cup. And so there's money tied up there that they have to account for. And whether you like it or not, their record with Val in the lineup tells a huge story about how important he is to this team.
And all the speculation that I've seen going around after him having a setback with his injury, and people are thinking maybe it's not because of that.
Yes.
Of course, I don't know, I'm sure you don't know. I'm sure Jesse doesn't know. I truly don't think that it's that. It's
We've
his
seen
injury.
him. He's there. He's at every
Mhm.
game. He's saying hi
Mhm.
to everybody. It's not that at
Mhm.
all. I feel bad. I feel like it's probably just a part of dealing with missing time for the reasons that he has, that there's always speculation if you are out of the lineup.
Yeah.
And I think, from a teammate perspective, it's okay for them to have a little concern around that trust, but when it's not that, and we can verifiably say that it's not that, we can calm down for a second and
Mhm.
just hope too that there's so much care and caution that the team seems to be approaching with all of their injuries this year, to include Miles Wood, who made his return to the lineup on this road trip. Did you miss him?
I missed him. And then he started playing and I was like, "Did I miss you that much? I don't know." He had an interesting game. It was iffy. It's what I would expect his game to be after coming back,
Yeah.
being out. How long was it?
Almost 2 months.
2 months. That's what you expect from a player that's been out for 2 months. I think yeah, his game wasn't there for me, and I think especially, like, defensively, he was not doing very well in my eyes.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is, well, one, I was really concerned to hear that it was back issues, and it's something that's bothered him a little bit before
Mhm.
and tweaked it in a way that kept him out nearly 2 months.
Right.
And it's something that is probably always going to be monitored throughout the rest of his career. It gives that sense around Duran right now where you're like, all right, he's back, but for how long until he's gone again?
Right.
And I don't like that. I think
Yeah,
they need a
I
little more security in their
Mhm.
lineup right now, and that's not Miles Wood's fault alone, but I thought he had some speed, which is normal. He is a quick skater,
Mhm.
but to your point, I think mentally the game wasn't there. Like, I think there's something to be said for mentally getting up to game speed in
Yeah.
addition to physically,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna give him some time, though, to
Yeah.
get that
Oh,
figured out,
100%. Mhm.
and playing on a line with a new player who's also been dropped into Colorado newly with Drury, like, he's gonna take some time to adjust too.
Mhm.
So, I'm excited for Ross Colton to
Yeah.
have Miles Wood back in the lineup.
Oh, of course, I'm excited about that, yes. I'm happy
I
that he has
think
his
it's
bestie back.
necessary for the vibes, at least.
I hope they just come out the next few games and it's just Ross. Like, he plays how he was playing before he got injured just
Yes,
because Miles is
because
back.
Miles is back.
That would be amazing.
That's the Miles Wood bump. Like, we haven't accounted for how Miles Wood returning can make everyone happy.
Somebody needs to do some analysis on how the two of them correlate. You know
I
what I mean?
do
Like,
wanna know.
how
You're
each of them
right.
play with both of them in the lineup versus just one.
That's so interesting because, like, you're right. When they play together specifically, it's not always the best results.
Mhm.
But if they're just together in the lineup,
Yes.
if that makes sense, I'm curious to see if we get a better version of Ross at the end of this.
Right?
And I think in talking about the personality that has left the room in Mikko
Mhm.
Rantanen, I would like to nominate Ross Colton as a new personality hire that we should talk about more because he is so good for the room, for his teammates. I think similar to Rantanen, he's serious and he's competitive, especially when you see him in playoff mode. But he's really light and he brings a lot of energy. And if
Mhm.
you ask anyone who plays on a line with him, Casey Middlestat said he's a good time. Like, he's
Yeah.
just fun to play
Yeah.
with. And I think they need the fun to play with guys
They
more than
do.
anything right now.
And I'm so happy losing Mikko that we have Wedgwood here.
You know,
And that
you're
personality in the
so
locker room.
right. That is an important aspect in all of this, is the Avs got ballsy and invested in goaltending, and they brought 2 great locker room guys,
Mhm.
to include Blackwood as well, who Miles Wood apparently adores.
I adore him. Did you see, like, I think it was Mosier doing or was it Kyle Keefe? I'm not sure. That did, like, the interview with him in the locker room, answering, like, really weird questions. Have you not seen that?
Do you remember any of the questions? Because that does sound familiar, and I'm trying to recall one of the questions.
No, I don't.
I feel like I did see this.
It was so funny though, and that was the first time I had seen, like, that much personality in a player that was willing to answer those questions and it actually be funny and fun for the fans
Yeah.
instead of just like, Why are you asking me this?
Yes, there are some players who go through doing the fun stuff with media, like they're being held hostage.
Yep.
And there's some who genuinely seem to enjoy it. I love Bobby Ballantyne's comment. Seeing Taves being goofy and upbeat last night made me feel better.
Yeah.
That is such a good point.
Mhm.
I don't think they're happy Mikko Rantanen's gone, but I think it is important for them to find joy where they can, and that was an incredible win. And I also loved media avoidant Devon Taves messing with Cale Makar during his
Yeah.
interview, and Makar saying like, "Oh, he just wants attention."
Wants the
because I
attention.
think that's the last thing he wants.
Yeah.
But I do think he wanted to be mischievous and
Yeah.
mess with Cale.
I know, that was hilarious. I love when they do stuff like that.
Me too. You see a little more of their personality. So, all right, let's kind of button this up. I still think this is a team that can win a cup, but to your point, I don't think they're done. I think they need something more. Have you pinpointed any particular needs you'd like to see them address?
I think the biggest thing is the depth that we talked about. I don't think I'm really concerned about anything other than that. Maybe like solidifying the third pair of defensemen would be the other thing that I'm like looking at right now, but I do think that the biggest thing is depth. I don't think they have their star players, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe they lost a Mikko, but they still have Nate, they still have Cale that can go out and kind of fill that.
Yeah. I think Necas too, and talking about like a bump and play for a player like Drury,
Mhm.
I don't think we know exactly what we're going to get from him other than it possibly going up from here.
Mhm.
And I think that's going to be exciting to watch. Bama Metcalf says a 2C or a right defenseman. I do think defenseman is going to be an interesting one. I think in talking about the flexibility of where they can spend money and on what, they have to make some decisions around Manson and a little bit Gerard to some extent, especially since Manson's year has been a little tough. It's not just the injury anymore. Like with
Mhm.
Manson, it was, can we get him healthy and playing on a regular basis? But this year, it's been a little bit more of mistakes that a second pair defenseman can't afford to make. And it's tough because I feel like people make Sam Girard a scapegoat all the time. So I don't want to do
No.
the same to Manson, but it's a lot of money to invest in the second pair that you should, but you need to make sure the return is good. And so I think they're going to have to do some kind of cost evaluation and how, pairs 2 and 3 are for Colorado moving forward. Because if Josh Manson begins to falter, they have good depth for the third pair, but it's not good depth to play up in the lineup on a second pair right now.
But it's also, looking at what's happening with Malinsky, and I don't know if Bednar is unsure about what he's doing with him just yet, but it seems like, from him, getting benched or being scratched, it's just, you don't really know what's happening.
That has been tough, right? Because he started the year exceeding expectation and being a full-time roster guy. So at the start, it was, we want to see him compete for the seventh man job on D. And he became a full-time bottom pair guy with the opportunity to move up in the lineup even. And so to see him get scratched, the trust with Bednar always does seem to be something that if you have seniority, like if you're a little bit older, a little bit more experienced, there's just a little more trust there. For Malinsky, he doesn't have that on his side. And it's a great point then. If Bednar doesn't necessarily trust what he's going to get from Malinsky nightly, it becomes challenging then to see who could be the guy that steps up if Manson's hurt or having an off night. I think they're comfortable with Malinsky in a third pair capacity, but not much beyond that right now. And my hope is, in talking to Malinsky on the practice before they went on the trip, my hope is that this is all just meant to inspire better from him because they saw better already. I think they just want to get him back to that. And that is my hope. But it's going to need to get back to where he was at the start of the year and stay there for some time. Because I do think his New York game was a little up and down. So I want to see consistency. I know for a lot of players being in the lineup nightly helps. So, you have to play the scratch card really carefully, especially with a relatively young player needing experience.
One other thing that I forgot to say about Necas, somebody mentioned something about face-offs, and I'm so happy we have him for that because I cannot trust Mikko or Nate with face-offs.
Yeah, I think like people have said, "Oh, he's not a center," but he's like a Mikko in that he can take face-offs
Mhm.
and can spot shift in the middle. He's more of a winger, but he has that capability. But so did Rantanen, you know what I mean? Like he was
Yeah.
a winger who could take face-offs, and when we tried Rantanen as the second line center, there's a reason that didn't work. And so I think they have a similar versatility. And different players I think can, because I think Drin can spot shift a little bit, but it's not his strong suit. So I'm excited to have another. There's an expression I'm trying to think of, like another ace up the sleeve. I don't think that's the expression, but another card in their deck. I've lost it. I've lost the plot, but
Isn't it just something up their sleeve?
something up
It's
there.
not like
I'm trying to think
there's
of a poker card specific thing,
Oh.
but I don't play poker, so I
don't know.
shouldn't have
Ace in
tried.
their hand.
Yeah, I shouldn't have tried. Christina asks, why is there seemingly such trust in Middleton? And I think it's a great question. I think it goes back to the roster construction concerns of like they have to pay the piper and reckon with where they've been able to get away with money being spent in different places. And I think that's a part of the lineup that they're trying to see if they can save a little bit of money. And I don't know. I don't think Middleton's a full-time solution as a third pair guy. I think he's a great seventh man, but I don't think he is a great full-time player. And I hate this, but this is one of my observations from just the games over the weekend. I think Malinsky is made worse playing with him. And I say that very similar to how I talked about Jack Johnson. Like, it's not that Middleton by himself is just this horrible player who shouldn't be on the ice, but he's not doing much to make the players around him better.
Mhm.
And I think that players like a Malinsky or Caleb Jones, when it was him, they need somebody like a DeHaan who is responsible in their own end, but can also get up ice and play the north-south game, and that's just not, I think, where Middleton thrives. And so because this is a team that spends a lot of time in the O-zone, you want a player who has a mind for that a little bit too, on your third pair even. You still want them to be a good stay-at-home defenseman, but if they can have a little bit of a mind for that, and a little bit of I don't know, the mobility, the puck skill for it, and I say that as Middleton picked up a point.
Mhm.
So I feel a little guilty saying that, but that's where I think Middleton, I'm not fully sold on. I see the value of having a player like him, but I don't see the fit full time.
I agree. I think they're really just looking at his size and his physicality, and I think that's what's having the Avs have a little bit of trust in him. I don't think that it's going to be I don't know how to put this, like a forever spot for him.
You know, it's a good point, the physicality. And with Manson not playing as well as we normally see, for Manson, one, I don't think it's a physical thing. I think it's a mental thing. I think he's making tough decisions, and I don't really understand why.
Mhm.
But I think you have to have the physicality represented in the decor somewhere. And if a Manson's not playing to 100%, it's good to have it represented, I guess,
Exactly.
by Middleton.
Mhm.
So, if Manson was gone and Middleton was gone, I think we'd see a bad result then too.
Yeah.
I do think it needs to be represented at least somewhere in the back end. But you sacrifice a little bit too, though.
Mhm.
You have to kind of measure, especially if they're not getting production from their back end, which Kel McCarr would like to have a word with you, then I can see where they're still trying to juggle this.
I agree.
All right, let's begin winding it down. They've got one more game to close out this road trip, and I thought the win over the Rangers was it was very exciting, but I also think it's worth noting how close it was
Mhm.
too. Second leg though in a back-to-back, so Avs get a lot of credit for being able to come back the way they did in that game, and I also think that McCarr was robbed of a hat trick.
Mhm.
So overall, I really like some of the things I saw, especially from the new players. What are your expectations for how they close this out against the Islanders?
The biggest thing that I didn't like from the game against the was that yesterday?
It was yesterday.
I don't know where I am. It was a crazy win. It was so fun to watch. Kale was amazing. This is like the second time that he should have had a hat trick and didn't get it. The whole time I was thinking, poor Blackwood. Like someone please help him out. Like give him a little bit of help back there because he was going through it. And I would like them to step up defensively because that was hard to watch them, at the end of it. What covered that up was them being able to make plays offensively. But defensively, you have to look at the fact that it was 4 goals.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of them born from poor net front coverage that just like a very specific play of Malinsky and Rempe below the goal line. And like Malinsky didn't even try. Yeah. And I can understand why. That's a huge height difference. But you just need to be better, not only in front of your net,
up the sleeve.
Thank you so much, Hurricane.
Oh my God.
Ace up the sleeve is exactly what I was looking for.
I didn't even think about that. And
Vaguely Sober also sent us a super chat. I hope everyone is feeling better. And I don't know if you guys can hear, but I don't sound like I normally do. But I am feeling better.
Yeah, I feel better too.
Just a little congested.
Thank you very much. Somebody also said in the chat, wait, so the Avs outscored their problems. They did.
That's such an interesting point because, well, and I give them some credit. Second leg of a back-to-back, you're probably going to have some problems. You don't want to see those same types of problems, though, when you're fully rested. So this will be an interesting game against the Islanders. And you've got some new players who've barely practiced with the team through 2 games. That's going to be its own challenge as well. But they're getting the goaltending. Like, even in, a 5-4 game where they've let in 4 goals, it's not because of bad goaltending. It's the goaltending that's kept them in and has helped them.
I agree.
So I want to shout out both the Blackwood-Wedgwood combination. They have established so much trust with Colorado and the team playing in front of them that they need a little bit more support. And I want to talk to you about someone else that you can trust. How would you like to get through the holidays without having to make your mortgage payment? Well, go to trustedamerican.com to see how they can help you refinance your home and not have to make any payments until February, which is right around the corner, so you should hurry. Trusted American salary-based mortgage consultants want to help you get into a better interest rate and lower your monthly payments, and right now they will cover the cost of your appraisal, a $650 value. Go to trustedamerican.com or scan the QR code on the screen to see how much money they can save you today. All right. Good goaltending, better net front coverage, and that also means being harder to play against in front of your net, which is something a Keaton Middleton does very well, to push, physically move bodies out of the way. So I appreciate that about him. I'm excited to see more of the Middlestat Lehkonen line hopefully get going. That'll be such a huge weight off a lot of shoulders, especially with Rantanen now gone. Their top 6 picture, it was always blurry, but you want that to start to come into focus now a little bit more. And I want to see players like Necas and Drury who are probably, like, I have to imagine, right? Everyone's mourning the loss of Mikko Rantanen. The fan base is in shambles. And if you're Necas or Drury, are you like, hey, we want to make a good impression. Like, we want to soothe your worries. Like, we're here. We can make a difference on this team. We might not be Mikko Rantanen. We get it, okay? Stop saying that. But I want to see them even to Carolina, right? Like, you gave up on 2 players. You didn't see our value, so we're going to show it to you by competing our hearts out here in Colorado. And Rantanen gets to do the same with Carolina, so, they both get a say in it. But I really do want to see them sort of silence the win or lost the trade thing by making a strong case for Avs won this trade because they got Jack Drury.
Yeah.
Okay? That means something around here. I want it to mean something because these games are important. They're tied for 3rd in the Central with the Wild at 60 points. 4-5-1 in their last 10. That loss against Boston was tough because It felt like they did a lot of the right things to win it, so I think there was definitely a lack of a Rantanen effect, like,
Mhm.
the shock of losing him and maybe some sadness around losing him. I think that the morale was low in that game, so
Yeah, to have that happen at 7 p.m. on Friday and then play at
Yes!
11 a.m. on Saturday, I forgive them for losing that game, and even then, I think they played well in that game. Bednar thought that too. He said, in his postgame yesterday that both games from this weekend, he thought they did very well in both.
I agree. I think that it was just a challenge
Mhm.
against Boston to, like, cope with losing Rantanen and trying to process it still. You've got 2 new players dropped into the
Yeah.
lineup.
I wasn't even expecting that they would play, having it happen so late and then having an early
I
game.
was also
I
surprised
was
to see
shocked.
that they were there.
Yeah.
It was a quick turnaround, so credit to everybody involved,
Mhm.
and then having the response against New York the next game. I think the happiness, the joy, from the team and being able to come back in the way that they did, because they started the game hot. They
Mhm.
had a lot of energy, 2 goals in 43 seconds,
Yep.
and they kinda let it get away from them, so I'm excited to see what this group does with the
Me
rest of
too.
the year, and I am like you, I'm just seated, waiting, checking my phone for another trade because I don't
Mhm.
think they're done.
I hope they aren't.
Alright, that's gonna do it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with another off ice and some game coverage as the Avs close out their road trip. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. This is Chloe Theil. Thank her for volunteering her time to talk about Mikko Rantanen today. I'm Megan Angley. I'll see you tomorrow.